Well, I just want to give a massive welcome to all of you for coming and joining us tonight for this, our third webinar in our Summer System Change webinar series. This is actually a webinar series funded by Irish Aid as part of our wider global citizenship education project. So this year and next Thursday, to be exact, is actually marks 5 years of Ireland's climate law and the anniversary of that from before when it came into force. So at that time, it was really widely recognised as a landmark moment for Ireland. And this law gave us what's arguably the strongest legal framework that we have to respond to the climate crisis. And it set out a really clear direction for Ireland to be able to reduce our emissions, to be able to meet our international and European obligations, as well as also building and bringing us closer towards achieving a more sustainable and just future. So 5 years on, this is giving us a great opportunity to be able to come together, take stock, ask what has the climate law actually achieved, where has it driven real progress, where has implementation maybe fallen short, and most importantly, giving us an opportunity to ask what needs to happen now if we are to see the promise of this law and what is to become a reality. So this couldn't be more timely, as well as we prepare to take on the presidency of the European Council or the Council of the European Union. Um, so we have, a unique opportunity to help shape Europe's climate agenda over the coming months at this critical moment. And we know that leadership on climate is about more than just ambition on paper. It's really about the implementation and the measure of our accountability and ensuring that the decisions that we're making and that we hold our government to account to today are consistent with the commitments that we've already made. So this is really essential. So tonight we're going to hear and talk about these themes from various perspectives, and we have a wonderful panel, as you can see. So I'm going to be delighted to bring them into the mix, but it isn't simply about reflecting on the last 5 years. It's also about using this moment to help us to shape the next 5 years. So I think that this is looking back, taking stock and looking ahead, and really what can we do individually and collectively as part of that, because we need all of us to really change everything. So I think that that's going to be really important. And I hope that today's discussion is really going to leave us not only better informed about where we are, clearer about that collective role and how we get there. So I'm really delighted to be able to introduce my colleague and Friends of the Earth Ireland's CEO, Deirdre Duffy, to kick things off. Deirdre, I'm going to hand over to you to do a welcome and set us off if that's all right.
Lovely. Thanks so much, Emma Jane. Thanks a million for that. And you're very welcome, everyone, to this webinar. And thank you to Emma Jane in particular for bringing us all together this evening. So, tonight you're going to hear from, as you can see, a panel of experts. And I just want to set the scene very briefly and say a few words because the passing of the Climate Act was a real fundamental shift for the climate environmental movement, as Emma Jane already um, pointed out. But I do want to take us back a little bit to 2021. It's 5 short years ago. You might hear from some people here tonight, God, it seems like an age ago when we had all this optimism and ambition and things are a bit different now. But in 2021, I mean, I believe it was Eamon Ryan, to be fair, he's a Green politician, but there was a significant discourse in the Oireachtas at the time when the bill was passed about this being one of the most important pieces of legislation that the state has ever passed, this 100-year-ish old state. And tonight we're going to have a look at maybe the things that have gone okay, like our first carbon budget. Maybe some sectors are meeting their emissions targets or being, a bit closer to them. I mean, I think it's fair to say that it has certainly transformed how the Irish state looks at its climate commitments. And at a very high level, it has strategically moved us from a state that was maybe relying on political rhetoric and a very weak legislative framework previously into a state that has replaced all those kind of voluntary commitments to one that has a legally binding framework, right? So we're here to celebrate the fact that this movement achieved that 5 years ago. And there's a lot to build on. I mean, you look at organizations like the OECD, the UN, they would have called out Ireland's climate law and said this is actually a really robust piece of legislation. And I don't want us to forget in the middle of all the debate and the doom and gloom that we see sometimes is that we do have a good climate act and it can transform how our public services in our state run. But I guess, having said that, if you look at where we're at now, there's a lot of disillusionment around how the government is reacting to the climate crisis. We're not moving fast enough. At Friends of the Earth, many of you are supporters, and thank you so much, and friends of the organization. I mean, we would be very, very strong in our belief that not only is it not faster, it is also not fairer. And actually, this transition has to be fair for everyone. So you can hold these two things at the same time, be frustrated and angry at the slow process, but also have a hopeful energy. And I'd like us to kind of dig into a little bit of that tonight as well. And as I finish up, because Emma Jane will start to introduce the speakers now, I just want to leave us with two things. When the Climate Act was passed, it was by 129 to 10 votes in the Dáil. That's 129 votes. Like, that is a serious mandate for what this legislative structure has given us, notwithstanding that they're trying to roll it back. We can hold the barricades on this law that means so much to us. And then the final thing I just wanted to share, as somebody who wasn't with Friends of the Earth 5 years ago, but was watching very closely outside and trying to contribute in my own way, for us as activists, people who are passionate about climate and really want the politics to live up to this legal and public ambition. Let's not forget that poll after poll shows us that the public want more action on climate. So, looking at the outside of the climate movement and the environmental movement 5 years ago, I think there is some learnings that we can pull up. What I saw was a movement that was really energized, that was full of activism, supporters, that that were intergenerational, using different tactics on the streets, doing actions, talking to politicians. I saw vibrant activism across all ages and sectors, and I saw a really coherent vision. And I think that's probably the challenge for us now, right? Is that law isn't a panacea. It doesn't solve all your problems. And I can make a nice lawyer joke here now because I am a lawyer, as are others on the screen. But like, law is such a powerful tool. It can shift things from something that's nice to do to something you have to do, but it won't give you all the answers. And we still need that activism, that vibrant energy that we're trying to build and support and nurture and grow in Friends of the Earth and stop climate chaos. So I leave it there, Emma Jane. I just wanted to say a few words to welcome people and really looking forward to hearing the contributions tonight.
Thank you so much, Deirdre. I think that was really insightful and helpful and creates a really nice foundation for us to kind of build on the conversation and discussion tonight. And we're actually really joined, we're very lucky, we're joined by just a handful of some of our amazing and wonderful Stop Climate Chaos Coalition allies and colleagues tonight. So yeah, I'd like to really introduce Sean McLaughlin, who is the Policy and Advocacy Officer with Christian Aid Ireland, and formerly a previous and amazing colleague of mine or of ours, who's now going to offer us a little bit of more of the context, that richness from both an EU and international or global perspective. So over to you, Sean.
Hi everyone. Thanks very much to Emma Jane and Friends of the Earth for, first of all, organising this important webinar at this important moment, 5 years on from the passing of the climate law, and inviting me to speak. So I'm just going to share my screen now with some slides. Let's hope this works. Go. And I'm just going to have to press. Great. That's visible. Yeah, so I'm just going to give a brief overview of essentially how the global fight against climate change has unfolded on a global level in the 5 years since the passing of the Climate Act. That'll hopefully set the stage for an examination of where we stand as Ireland assumes its presidency of the Council of the European Union. And then finally, I'll provide a set of concrete actions that we've put together through our work in Stop Climate Chaos that the Irish government should take to immediately pursue a climate just transition and increase its credibility, crucially, on the global stage as it assumes the EU presidency. So I'll just start now. So yeah, this is where we stand on the global level from passing a 2021 Climate Act to now in 2026. So In the summer of 2021, just a month after Ireland's Climate Act was signed into law by the President, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, released its first AR6 working group report, which the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said represented nothing less than a code red for humanity, and called on world leaders to act decisively now to keep 1.5 degrees alive. So it unfortunately probably won't come as a surprise to anyone to hear the quite sad and devastating fact that the world clearly didn't heed this call to action in the past 5 years. 2025, as these headlines show, was a record-breaking year, and so was 2024. 2026 is set to continue in the same fashion. Summer temperatures are increasing across the world. Extreme weather events are impacting more lives and livelihoods than ever before. In addition, and this is perhaps the most devastating fact, that 2025 also saw the highest level of greenhouse gas emissions emitted into the atmosphere, higher than any other year in human history, including 2021. So it's clear that code red wasn't heeded. As it stands, there's only 6% of the global carbon budget for 1.5 degrees remaining, and if current emission levels persist, there's a 50% chance that global warming of 1.5 degrees will be exceeded within 4 years. The world is heading for 2.8 degrees. This leaves the world heading for about 2.8 degrees of global heating by the end of the century, with recent pledges being criticized by the UN Environment Programme as barely moving the needle. The consequences of this, I won't go into them, but they're catastrophic. This means island nations disappearing, hundreds of millions of people being exposed to food and water insecurity, and it means that's really only starting to scratch the surface of the consequences. And at the same time, fossil fuel financing continues to flow, oftentimes through Ireland, into expansion around the world. Investments in fossil fuels grew from 742 billion in 2021 to 906 billion in 2025. So the global picture, the word sort of fails to say, but it's not looking good. At the same time, we have a chronic underinvestment. While we have a chronic overinvestment in fossil fuels, we have a chronic underinvestment in providing climate finance, which is essentially the climate debt that's owed by wealthy, high-emitting, polluting corporations and individuals. They owe this debt essentially to communities and vulnerable countries that will suffer and continue to suffer most from the impacts of climate change. Despite an independent high-level expert group concluding that 1.3 trillion US dollars will be needed to be provided annually to so-called developing nations in order to transition away from fossil fuels and to adapt to climate change, COP29 agreed a global goal of only 300 billion, which is less than a quarter of what will be needed in the coming years. So it's within this quite dark global context that we come into where the European Union finds itself 5 years after Ireland's climate law was enacted. So in the summer of 2021, the European Green Deal was in full swing. The same month that the Climate Act was signed into law, the European Commission launched its Fit for 55 legislative package. This is a framework of over a dozen connected proposals designed to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 55% by 2030. I should make it clear that the EU's approach to climate action under the Green Deal was far from perfect back in 2021, but even that imperfect vision is quite a far cry from where we find ourselves now in July 2026. So the EU in July 2026, essentially, as a result and influenced by the multiple crises that the EU has experienced over the past number of years, the second von der Leyen Commission has been engaging in what has been termed a quiet hollowing out of the Green Deal, and essentially a transfiguration of it into what has been now termed a clean industrial deal. At the same time, this has been accompanied by a wide-ranging, aggressive, and fast-paced pursuit of deregulatory measures which seek to roll back environmental and human rights protections across the board, under the auspices of easing regulatory burdens on businesses. It's this context at the EU level that we're coming into that Ireland assumes the rotating presidency of the Council of the European Union. To explain what it is, the presidency rotates every 6 months among 27 EU member states. The primary job of the presidency is to act as a neutral, honest broker that drives the legislative agenda, chairs meetings, and negotiates compromises between member states and other institutions. The president essentially organizes and leads meetings of the Council of the EU at the ministerial level. While oftentimes the member states will pitch the presidency as an administrative functional role, the reality is that Ireland's presidency does give our state a certain degree of agenda setting power, which can often be used to steer the direction of the European Union. So the core question that I'd like to pose on the next couple of slides is how can Ireland seek to claim climate credibility in this role as it moves into this role over the next 6 months, especially in the context where we're, off track to meet our binding emissions targets 2030, where we're projected to miss them by over half of the legally obliged 51% reduction by 2030. So what is to be done in this situation? The answer that we're calling for and the key demand that we're calling for over the next 6 months is the Irish government must take the immediate steps to end fossil power. That is the headline demand. That is what we'll be fighting for, and that's what we'll be calling for as we go out into the streets in the middle of COP 31 in Turkey to demand this. So which Sarah will talk about more later. Um, and I just wanted to quote this. It's actually a science fiction author here. It's William Gibson has said this: the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed. So despite all the darkness of the stats and the political developments that I've quoted over the last few minutes, there are pockets of hope and pockets of light in actions that are currently being taken around the world and actions that we're calling on the Irish government to follow in line with. Um, so first of all, overall, we need to act now to phase out fossil fuels. This is being reflected in the highest levels of the international apparatus, with the ICJ declaring that failure to phase out fossil fuels may constitute an internationally wrongful act, which is attributable to that state, down to the level of the island of Samso in Denmark, which is the first 100% renewable energy self-sufficient island. So the fossil fuel phase that is happening in some places. We just need to broaden it out. France has provided a first of its kind fossil fuel phase out roadmap. We're calling on the Irish government to do the same as it moves into its EU presidency. Um, we need a moratorium on new data centers. Everyone here will be familiar with Friends of the Earth's campaigning on the issue of data centers, which now consume over a quarter of Ireland's electricity demand. Um, UN Special Rapporteur has called for a moratorium. New York State has recently imposed a moratorium on data centers, and Amsterdam is not allowing any more data centers. We're simply calling on the Irish government to follow the example of this unevenly distributed future and distribute this in Ireland by imposing a moratorium on data centers. We need to fast track public transport and active transport over roads. The picture in the top left-hand corner is the neighborhood of Cul-de-sac in Arizona, which is a completely car-free neighborhood, one of an increasing number around the world. These are the type of neighborhoods we need in every community, in every town, every village in Ireland. And we need to fast track, take the actions needed under government policy in the next climate action plan to fast track these developments. We need to provide warm homes for all. Countries around Europe are unveiling their social climate action plans, which are drawing down millions and billions to fund home retrofits and to save people money on their electricity bills. Ireland has yet to publish this social climate action plan and is therefore missing out on this essential resource. So we're calling on the government to publish that immediately too. And finally, on a global level, we're looking for Ireland to essentially keep our climate promises, to scale up our climate finance offerings, to endorse the negotiating mandate for a global treaty to phase out fossil fuels, as countries like Pakistan and the Bahamas have done recently. We're essentially looking for the Irish government to recommit to all our climate promises as instituted under the 2021 Climate Act and the Paris Agreement, and to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees, and if it goes 1.5 degrees, to bring it back down as quickly as possible. So that's a quick overview there of where we stand on the international, global, and EU level, and what we're calling for at this sort of critical juncture. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Sean. That was really comprehensive. Thank you for that. Um, I'd now like to welcome Clodagh Daly, who is manager of the Centre for Environmental Justice, CLM, as you might know them as. He's going to offer us an insight into the role of litigation as a mechanism and a tool for ensuring the implementation of the climate law, and like what kind of progress have we made. So Clodagh, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks so much, Emma Jane. I'm just going to see now if I can share my screen if this works. Is that okay?
Looks great.
Super. So thanks so much to Emma Jane and everyone at Friends of the Earth for bringing us all here together and to Stop Climate Chaos as well. We are delighted to be a member of the coalition. And thanks to everyone for joining us on this very warm July evening. So my name is Clodagh Daly. I work in Community Law and Mediation's Centre for Environmental Justice. And this evening I'm going to speak about our work on climate litigation, why it's necessary as we look back on the last 5 years of the Climate Act, and just provide a very quick overview of some of the cases that we've taken to date. So just by way of a very quick introduction about who we are. So CLM was set up in 1975 as part of the campaign for civil legal aid in Ireland, and we were the first community law centre in the country. So our services are available to anyone across the country who needs them. And generally, we provide free legal advice in more traditional areas of law like housing, employment, social welfare, anything related to discrimination or inequality, and more recently, children's law as well. And then in 2021, actually the same year that the climate law was amended, we established Ireland's first Centre for Environmental Justice, which was launched by Mary Robinson and is the first of its kind in Ireland. And I suppose what brought our organisation into this space was the realization that the communities we work with were being impacted by environmental harms and climate harms, but we hadn't been looking at it from that perspective before. So we were seeing people present to our clinics whose homes were being repeatedly flooded and they could no longer get insurance. We were seeing people whose health was being impacted by air pollution caused by where they lived and where they could afford to live. And so we realized that there was actually a need for a community law centre to step into that space. But we were also set up at a time when Ireland signed up to these really ambitious and really necessary climate targets. And in recognizing that our emissions need to be reduced really rapidly, we also saw that there was a need for advocacy around ensuring that emissions reductions are delivered in a way that's fair. And that's inclusive of those who are most vulnerable, not only to climate change, but potentially to climate policy as well. We think that climate action can really build equality and a fairer society if it's done right. So at the end of this talk, I'm going to share a 5-year report that just gives a snapshot of the work that we've been doing over the last 5 years, if anyone's interested in looking at the rest of our work. But just to, I suppose, briefly look at, why is climate litigation necessary? And I suppose it exists because our politics is failing to meet the defining challenge of our time. And as we sit here in the second heat wave of the summer, that's really, really clear. And Sean has already outlined that in really stark terms. We are not reducing emissions at the pace the law requires. To stay within our legally binding targets in Ireland, the Environmental Protection Agency has warned that emissions need to fall more than 4 times faster than they did last year. And our Minister for Climate, Darragh O'Brien, stated earlier this year that Ireland will miss its 2030 emission reduction target by half. This is really not acceptable and it should concern all of us. And this is where litigation can support the environmental movement. Our climate policies should provide the roadmap for how Ireland will meet its obligations. And if these plans don't demonstrate how Ireland will actually reduce its emissions, then they're failing in their purpose. So this is where litigation can potentially play a role. It's a really important accountability mechanism when political commitments are not matched by meaningful action. And this is not out of step with public opinion. The overwhelming majority of people in Ireland believe that climate action can improve the quality of life. This is supported by evidence. The Climate Change Advisory Council, the Fiscal Advisory Council, the Environmental Protection Agency, the National Economic and Social Council have repeatedly highlighted that emissions can be reduced in Ireland while creating employment, reducing energy bills and transport costs, and delivering warmer homes and improved public services. So there is an opportunity to secure a fair and more equal society, again, that Sean spoke about, through climate action, and that is why we as a community law centre are engaged in these cases. So the first case that I'm going to speak about is a challenge to the Climate Action Plan 2023, where we are representing an NGO, Friends of the Irish Environment. We last week got really exciting news that the case has been granted leave to go to the Supreme Court. And essentially, the question at the heart of the case is about when our climate law requires the government to ensure that a climate action plan is consistent with Ireland's carbon budgets, what does that actually mean? So, can the government simply state that a plan will work, or does it need to demonstrate with evidence and with quantified measures that the plan will actually deliver emissions reductions as required by law? And the other question that we are bringing before the court is whether citizens challenging these climate policies should be required to provide expert evidence, particularly when there is a very short time frame allowed for judicial reviews. So the case has been through the High Court and the Court of Appeal already. And although those courts didn't rule in our favour, they definitely didn't suggest that Ireland's track record on climate is adequate. And this quote here is just from the High Court, where they say clearly what this judgment most certainly is not is a finding that Ireland's climate ambitions are on track. And they highlighted that urgent and significant additional action is required. This case is really exciting. It's the second case of its kind where Ireland's national climate plan and the adequacy of Ireland's national climate plan is being assessed before our highest court of law. And it's actually the first time that a national climate plan has been assessed since the Climate Act has been strengthened. So it's definitely one to watch. We don't have a hearing date just yet, but I would watch this space. And what was notable in granting Friends of the Irish Environment and ourselves leave for appeal, the Supreme Court recognised that these questions have implications not just for the 2023 Climate Action Plan, but for every future Climate Action Plan. And essentially what we're looking for in bringing this case and what a win would look like from our perspective is that it would really provide, I think, much needed clarity about what the Climate Act actually requires and would help us to ensure that future climate action plans contain clear and evidence-based pathways showing exactly how Ireland will meet its legally binding carbon budgets. The second case then is a challenge to Ireland's Climate Action Plan 2024. So this case is taken by a grandfather who you can see in the picture here, a youth climate activist and a child, and we are joining them in this action. We are actually acting as an applicant in the first time in our 50-year history on behalf of the communities that we work with and represent in a challenge to Ireland's Climate Action Plan 2024. So a hearing date is awaited before the High Court. And in taking this case, I suppose those most impacted by climate change are seeking to hold the Irish government to account. And their message is really clear and simple that those who will bear the greatest burden of climate change deserve laws and policies that genuinely protect their future. And what we're looking to achieve with this case is that I suppose we're arguing not only that the Climate Action Plan fails to comply with Ireland's Climate Act, which we're discussing this evening, but that an inadequate climate action plan violates fundamental rights as protected under the Irish Constitution, the European Convention on Human Rights, and the European Charter of Fundamental Rights. And this case builds on the landmark decision of the European Court of Human Rights in the Swiss Clima Signorinen or Swiss Grannies case, as people might know it as, where the court confirmed in 2024 that inadequate climate action can amount to a breach of human rights. So if this case were to succeed, it would establish not only that climate plans which fail to meet legal requirements are unlawful, but they may also violate fundamental rights. So a High Court hearing date is awaited in that case as well. And our work does extend beyond Ireland. We are delighted to be representing NGOs, Global Legal Action Network and Climate Action Network in a case against the European Commission. So this case essentially is challenging the adequacy of the EU's emission allocations as they are designated to member states under the EU's effort sharing regulation. And these emissions cover sectors that are responsible for almost 60% of the EU's emissions in areas like building, heat, and transport. And so we argue that the emissions allocations that the EU has designated to member states under the effort sharing regulation fall far short of what is actually needed to keep global warming to 1.5 and to safeguard fundamental rights. So that case was heard before the EU General Court in Luxembourg last September, and a judgment is actually expected on the 2nd of September this year. So it'll be really interesting to see how that develops. So I've actually kept my slides really short because I was conscious of having a number of speakers and not wanting to go over time, but I'm really happy to take any questions that people might have. And I suppose just to sum up, taken together, these cases are about, I suppose, ensuring that governments can't simply announce really ambitious targets without explaining exactly how they'll be achieved. And they're about protecting our rights by ensuring that our climate law actually has real meaning. I'd very much support Deirdre's comments that the law is definitely not a panacea, but it can be a really powerful tool. It doesn't give us all the answers, but I do hope it can act in service of and in support of the environmental and climate movement in Ireland. And thanks so much again to Friends of the Earth for bringing us all together to discuss these really important issues. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Clodagh. It's really insightful, and I think it's really helpful for all of us who are not coming from a legal background to really grapple with these things, because I think sometimes these issues get so big, we just want it faster, we want it fairer, but it's thanks to the work that you're doing that's really helping to have the stick, and holding our government to account. And I think it's really valuable work. So thank you so much for sharing that breakdown with us. It's really useful. Um, I'd like to hand over to my colleague Jerry. Jerry, I know your camera's off. I hope that's okay for us to hand over to you now, if that's all right. And Jerry McEvely, sorry, Jerry, is our head of policy in Friends of the Earth Ireland. And Jerry's going to walk us through some examples of how the Irish government has actually been undermining and contradicting the climate law. So building on some of that rich baseline that Clodagh's already just outlined for us all just a moment ago. So Jerry, I'll hand over to you.
Sure, thanks a lot. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Emma-Jane and everyone for your presentations. I think mine will, thankfully, follow somewhat coherently on what's come before. I won't do an overview slide. The basic sort of narrative arc is I'm going to depress you, and then I'm going to try to briefly give you some hope at the end. That's what's basically going to happen. So I will share my slides, and you have to not see how many tabs I have open at the same time. That's the next step. I think you are going to see how many tabs I have open at the same time. Just pretend you didn't see that, everyone. Can you see my screen?
Almost. Yeah. Just loading. Yep.
Just loading. Okay.
Yep.
I'll put that into slideshow mode. Okay, here we go. All right, so like Sean has given you a really good overview of the state of play at the international level. And I think like Clodagh, in terms of the grounds for litigation, at national level, probably no one will be surprised to hear me say the situation isn't great. So emissions fell by 2% in 2025. There were reductions across some of the sectors. And the bottom line in terms of this slide is that we should have about a 14% reduction by 2025, but that's far off the 51% that we need to get to by 2030. And what the EPA have said is that emissions would have to fall by more than 10% annually to get to that 2030 target. I'm going to talk a little bit more later about where these targets come from, like obviously in our national climate law. But moving beyond that, when you look at like the envelope or how much emissions were allowed to act within, we're on track for the first carbon budget. But things are still not where they should be. Even within that, the transport sector was 8% above, industry the same. And we're in a very problematic position with agriculture, that we're now even struggling to compare where agri-emissions are at because of various technical issues and changes. There is still some progress, particularly on the residential side, that we're actually 5% lower. And that means essentially that our housing is becoming more climate friendly, if you like. But in the same way as on the national side, on the EU side as well, we're far off. Basically, we're far off our 2030 target. And the EPA have also done projections as to, so that was, historic emissions, what I was looking at before. But if you look at, when they look at 2030, they've said that they're likely to fall by 25% on the basis of, all the proposed measures, when the target is 51%. And I've even heard said before, and this is where people need to be really careful, the language that we hear and the narratives that are put forward, that means that at the moment we're basically halfway to halfway in inverted commas, and putting a very positive slant on things. And if you went to your bank manager and said you're halfway to halfway on a loan, I'm not sure he'd have the same interpretation. So that's one thing to be careful about. And I mentioned that we're on track for the first carbon budget, but we are definitely not for the second. As Clodagh mentioned, we're very likely to exceed that. And and I mentioned before that we're only likely to achieve 23% of our separate EU climate target. And I'm just going to throw this in very quickly. Occasionally, when you listen to any debate about climate, I like to do climate bingo, which are the straw man arguments that are always raised in any climate interview. One of them is that, but Ireland is just a small country. We're not doing enough, but hey, we're just small. And whistle stop tour, all countries have to take responsibility for their own mess. If only there was a law that said this internationally. There is. It's called the Paris Agreement, and that's what informs our national law and also EU law. The big boys aren't all bad. There are some really positive examples of larger states really reducing emissions. We have the highest net emissions per capita. When you look at per capita basis, we are really not in a good place. And more broadly, this links up with what Sean said, every emission, every delay, fundamentally and unfortunately worsens the climate crisis and means more cost. And we also have, again, like what Sean was touching on, Ireland as a developed country, we have a greater responsibility and greater capacity. And ultimately, all small country actions, they all add up. So I've started with the bad news, but this is like what is supposed to be happening. So we have a climate act. It's not a roadmap. It doesn't say X must happen now, but it provides a legal framework. And that legal framework, where it's not being respected, does provide grounds for litigation, as Clodagh was explaining. But it requires governments to make plans, stay within emissions budgets and targets, report on progress, and be held accountable if they fall behind. But I hear you say, but they are behind. And already in terms of accountability, at the moment with this government, our 2026 climate action plan is 6 months late. And crucially, like in terms of accountability, we need to see how it's not simply about catching departments or public bodies out. It's about that they come forward with their measures, and where there are challenges, that government reports that to the Oireachtas and at least seeks to come forward with corrective measures. What does corrective measures mean? New, better policies in the next climate action plan. But that hasn't happened. And more broadly speaking, like, government is not respecting its own programme for government commitments, which not only say that it needs to comply with climate law, its existing climate law, but also reduce reliance on fossil fuel. So what's the upshot? I'm not going to dwell on this, but anyone who's on this call will already be aware it's not good. The hottest May day on record. We've had really bad storms in recent years. There's much more, disturbing potential outcomes, including, how Ireland's, how we have a warmer climate in Ireland due to this Atlantic meridional overturning. And that is weakening. And as a result of our non-compliance, we're really facing significant costs in the billions. And obviously the focus should be on spending that money now, not paying these non-compliance costs in the future. And so I am going to get into just a little bit about what's in the climate law. And one of the key measures in it is what we in the NGO world continuously refer to as Section 15, Section 15, Section 15, Section 15. But what that basically does is it's about, I would say, operationalizing the climate law. It means that public bodies have to give effect and act within those climate policies and those targets. And I guess the challenge that we face is, broadly speaking, we do not see public bodies respecting that in the way that they should. And to give one example, I'm going to give more, but to give one example is a case that we're taking with Friends of the Irish Environment and Climate Earth related to a decision that the energy regulator has related to a decision that it has taken. And basically, I'm going to summarize this very briefly. It has said that, the Climate Act can't be prioritized in terms of the energy regulator's functions, and that it can't require, in its approach to connecting data centers, it can't limit those connections or require emissions reductions in order to ensure compliance with climate law. And we take a different view that, in fact, that Section 15 does require its decision to respect those climate policies and objectives that I mentioned earlier. And more broadly, one of the reasons why Section 15 is so important is because the Supreme Court has actually been very clear on what it means and has really explained how far the power goes. I will caveat all of this that I am not a lawyer. Don't go buying any mortgages or insurance on the basis of what I'm about to say. Rates may go up as well as down. What I mean by that is there are also some very clever people on this in this session who can give an even more insightful and potentially accurate analysis than what I'm about to give. But the basic point is that they said that this Section 15 is legally enforceable. It's not some box-sticking exercise that bodies just have to give some consideration to. It applies to all of them when they're exercising their statutory functions in compliance with, as I said, the National Climate Objective, carbon budgets, climate action plans. And it requires consistency, and it's not absolute compliance that, they may hereby never do anything. Public bodies may never do anything that will increase an emission. But it is substantive and it has to be respected as part of their functions. Now, what we are seeing is that specific provision is actually being disapplied from relevant government bill. This is obviously something of massive concern to everyone on this call. And the three cases where it's being disapplied is the government's Strategic Gas Reserve Bill, which relates to its development of LNG, which is really problematic. I'll come back to that. Also, the Dublin Airport, I should say, passenger capacity bill. And lastly, it's now Critical Infrastructure Act, which has become law. And this is evidence in our book of, unfortunately, the government rowing back from its commitment. And the reason they have expressly given for this is that they're concerned about cases being taken, judicial review cases I should say, being taken on the back of or in light of that full glass judgment from the Supreme Court. And what's interesting is that government almost seems to be saying that they accept that it has that Section 15 and what public bodies must do is legally effective, but that it only increases judicial review risk. But equally removing a climate duty just because of judicial review, that raises equally substantive legal questions. And I guess our main concern is that this isn't simply about improving efficiency and getting infrastructure in there more quickly. It's about reducing accountability. And to be clear, and I'll go through this briefly, like what Section 15 says, it's not about, and I guess this is important maybe in terms of how the media picked this up and statements made by ministers. Section 15, it's not about courts deciding on whether an infrastructure project should go ahead. It's about consistent climate consistent decision making. What does that mean? Coherence, that there should be proper coherence from government in terms of the infrastructure that it's developing. And it's supposed to guide decisions before a project, that a project, government has the opportunity to develop infrastructure in accordance with climate law. It's not simply about the courts or someone going to court to change things or stop things afterwards. And as I said, about aligning decisions with climate action plans and carbon budgets, not simply preventing infrastructure. And really briefly, we're sort of forgetting that as part of all this, having this degree of consistency can also support projects like government wants to put in place. For example, grid infrastructure or metro or much greater public transport infrastructure. And there may be challenges to that. And government can be saying, well, hold on a minute, we need to make sure we're consistent with climate law. I'm obviously simplifying a lot here, but the framing as only a negative is problematic, as is potentially creating a two-tier type of system where you have state projects or state infrastructure that are definitely impacting emissions, are potentially the least constrained by climate obligations. And as has already been said, that this is happening as Ireland is going into its EU Council presidency and another COP at the end of the year. There are naturally questions about its commitment to climate action. So, and that's a repeat. So, it's not the end of the matter when it comes to the climate law. I know I've done a real deep dive there, but what can we be asking for? What other things are relevant when it comes to climate law? And even though, as Deirdre said, and Rhoda said, it's not absolutely everything. We need more than simply references in law, but we need government to live up to its own commitments in the climate law in terms of accountability and oversight. There may be weaknesses also worth coming back to. For example, a key issue is, while there's such a focus on renewables, what about demand? As Sean said, data center demand is skyrocketing. And what's really problematic is that there's not enough specifics on what's the problem here. We need to be phasing out fossil fuels. And while that is blindingly obvious, it is not, I guess, explicitly stated as a requirement in terms of those policies and targets and carbon budgets that I mentioned earlier. And even when it comes to public bodies, many of which are doing fantastic work, should we be looking at the essentially founding legislation or mandates of these bodies to be really explicit that they have a positive role to play in supporting climate action. And there's hope. You mightn't believe there's hope after what I've just been through, but the EPA have done a fantastic climate change in the Irish Mind survey about public attitudes to climate action. Long story short, people understand that it's a problem and they want more. And that is across sort of political affiliations, across rural and urban. That is also borne out from our own polling, that people are really clear that they want government to move away from fossil fuels, and they want more action, and that includes the likes of supporters of government parties. And the solutions are out there. They are absolutely there and they're available. And I've mentioned there our own recent crisis to security report, which is on our website. But as you can imagine, there are really fantastic recommendations and resources from the likes of the Climate Change Advisory Council as well. So that's basically the end. But just before I leave, having said it's not all about the law, don't give up, mobilize, form alliances. If you don't know what else to say to a politician, just use the word climate action. You don't necessarily need to provide an assessment of Section 15. And remember, the public is behind us. And when you're sort of wondering, what can I do? That's all fine and dandy, but what can I do? There are excellent campaign resources and opportunities to get involved on the Friends of the Earth website, on our data center and energy poverty campaigns, and also our work against LNG. And just to give that as an example, there are links to how you can be contacting your TD on the LNG bill. There's much more on that coming, unfortunately, later in the year. So we should be contact politicians. I'm using LNG as an example, but you could think of others in terms of perhaps data centers or other problematic projects, contacting local politicians in Clare in the case of LNG. And as I said, we need to come together and take action. And that's it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Jerry. That was really great. I think you've given us a number of different examples that you did delve deep. There's a lot in that, covered a lot of ground. I'm still digesting for sure, as I'm sure others are. But thank you very much. I think that was really, really helpful and very clear examples. Just a key reminder as well before we go over to our final speaker, just that you can use the Q&A function or the chat box to be able to share any comments or any questions you might have for us. We're going to have some time for some Q&A afterwards in a moment. So I just wanted to just make that available to you. So before I hand over to the wonderful Sarah Hurley, who's the coordinator of Stop Climate Chaos Coalition, to which we are a member of, Sarah, over to you to bring the hope and the positivity, I hope. What can we do?
Hope and positivity. Okay, that will be featured, I promise. So can everyone see the slides okay? Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so and just an aside, I've been in another webinar with Jerry in the last week, and I love the climate bingo, and his 10 myths on climate are fantastic. So hopefully we get to see that as a resource as well. But anyway, the question today we've explored is Ireland ready to lead Europe? And our speakers have laid out Ireland's national and international obligations and what might be expected during the presidency. And based on the context been given by Deirdre, Jerry, Clodagh, and Sean, you might have had a lot of different thoughts and feelings. So my name is Sarah. I'm the coordinator for Stop Climate Chaos. And since this week, we are 40 organisations coming together to work for a better climate future for Ireland. We represent environmental groups, students' unions, faith-based groups, international development aid, and other civil society organisations since 2007. And our main advocacy around the climate law and climate bill was a major campaign. So for us, it's extremely worrying to see the slow implementation of policy, and in some cases, the rollback of climate law and emissions reductions. So as you can hear, I'm in a very experienced and knowledgeable company in Stop Climate Chaos, and every day I do learn so much. And I do take a lot on heart in knowing that there's a lot of great work and powerful work that is happening globally. We might not see it all the time, but it is happening. And because of that work, people are trying to do their best to push the needle towards progress. And how that really is impacted or supported by is through our collective voices being very loud. We have a great privilege in Ireland to have a high level of access to our decision makers. However, I think it's really important to note that there is a lot less engagement with civil society organisations. So we must renew our efforts to build public awareness and public voice about systemic change that we need to see. So that's why a session like today is so important. So based on what you've heard this evening, you might wonder, how is it that Ireland is now in a very important position while being potentially climate laggards? They have been called out by the Greens in European Parliament and asked to ensure that they step up and lead during their presidency. So a question is how can Ireland lead in Europe while at the same time Darragh O'Brien has said that he would be negotiating with the European Commission with a view to avoiding any related costs to Ireland. And that's due, of course, to the fines that we could be potentially facing because of years of inaction. And that, alongside his power to greenlight new polluting fossil fuel projects and infrastructure, really amounts to a climate hypocrisy. And as well as we all well know, talking out both sides of our mouth doesn't overcome climate science. And deeming fossil fuel infrastructure to be compliant is the same as saying that the emperor's clothes are beautiful and perhaps compliant. And while we're in the worst heat wave and droughts and terrible floods in Europe and the Arctic are heating faster than the rest of the world, we must prepare and we must mitigate the worst. And there's Say O'Connor, one of our young climate activists, who is always at the forefront of climate negotiations still. So, we have a kind of a strong red thread of people who have continuously stood out for climate action. So what do we do next? What can we do? We could potentially give in to apathy. We could follow along and pretend that the business as usual is the way to solve this mess. I think that is unrealistic, and it sets future generations up for things that we have not yet seen or experienced. Or we could use our collective power to raise our voices and push back. Ireland wants to be seen as best in class on the world stage, and other countries do look to Ireland for leadership and to match up with our humanitarian reputation. So Ireland is leading the negotiations at COP, and we'll be here in Ireland to take to the streets again. And maybe to give you some energy and to show you what people power does look like, I can talk you through how climate movement had been largely silenced due to COVID came back into full volume and colour last year. And we also had a mass demo for, hold on, where are we? Yeah, we also had a mass demo for climate in December, which followed 2 weeks after the climate march. And the TDs who attended that day, over 40, had mentioned how much they'd seen the rise in the volume again for climate action, and we were impressed by the numbers. So it did take months of work, late nights, weekends, going to meet different groups to get their endorsement and encourage them to join the march. It took people power across our member organizations who were doing all this work additional to the work that they already do in their everyday organizations. We were having weekly meetings, updating Excel sheets, WhatsApp groups that grow to over 100 members. We were getting videos, people were sharing things on social media, and slowly the word was spreading. And then recent climate marches had been much smaller with less than 100 people. And we really didn't know how many people would show up. We were, seeing some positive numbers on mailing lists, but you never know how that actually turns out in real life. And if anyone remembers, Saturday was the climate march. And on Friday night, I was getting messages, will the climate march be going ahead still? If you remember, there was an orange warning for wind and we was set to clear by 12 p.m. the next day. 1 p.m. was our starting time, and we decided to go ahead. It was opened by a wonderful interfaith prayer, and you could see people had joined from all corners of the island. We had fabulous stewards that were volunteers helping people to keep pace and be steadfast. We had thousands of people, and based on how long it took the area covered, a good estimate would be about 4,000 people. So we can all wonder how much bigger it would have been had we had stable weather. And I guess that's never going to be a stable variable as we go into, another season of dramatic extremes. We had brilliant speakers joining the dots, speaking on intersecting issues of gender, global south countries, genocide, ecocide, social equality, and the risk of LNG. We also did have music that uplifted our spirits while calling out who's responsible. So the big polluters, the billionaire class. And then we spoke about how that change can happen, or what change can happen if we all chip in. The student bloc were extremely loud. One of the Climate Justice University's members sang out loud above all other voices, above thousands. She had no megaphone, so if anyone could get her a megaphone for next time, please do. We showed up with posters, we had families, we had little kids that came out on what was, a very unpleasant day. And I started out at the very front of the march and I realised around Westmoreland Street that I needed to see what was happening behind me. And honestly, that was probably the most profound moment of my life, was seeing thousands of people who showed up with all their banners representing all the different pockets of Irish life and the things that they cared about. Groups from Scaries, Cork, workers' unions, teachers, librarians, scientists, community gardens, and all the wonderful outfits and costumes that came along with it. There were clever slogans and messages, and then down to the most simple of Stop Climate Chaos. So I hope that if you were there, you were also able to feel that rise in energy and that had been dormant for quite a while. So we'll be taken to the streets again, and we'll be during the COP negotiations, and we're asking you to come along. And these are just some cool pictures. And I didn't know that any of these people are going to show up. And it was so cool just to see all the different diversity of slogans. And I really love this one with the family and the kids. And the kids are having a great time. So, if you're going to come to the march, bring your kids, bring some, nice warm clothes, some snacks, and we'll all be there having a great time. So we'll be keeping the pressure with our eyes being on Ireland during the EU mission, as EU ministers will be coming and visiting in Ireland. And if you want to get involved, you absolutely can. You can join us here on our website, stopclimatechaos.ie, and under the events section, you'll find this form, and you can just sign on to our email list there. And Emma Jane will be able to share that in any of the follow-up materials as well. And you can get in touch with us at info@stopclimatechaos. So I hope that's uplifted you a little bit, and it was a nice reminder for me to go and see all the kind of exciting things that we did last November.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was really beautiful. And I think you definitely captured our hearts and hope and positivity for things we can do upcoming. And we will be sending around to follow up with everyone. I'm conscious of time, but there are a number of questions that are still there. So thank you to everybody who has shared those. I guess Sarah has kind of proposed for one of the questions about some of the takeaway actions that we can do after the webinar. We will follow up and give you some of that. But I suppose that maybe some of these ones, there was a question there about maybe this is to you, Clodagh, can legal cases relating to climate action not be fast-tracked given the time-sensitive nature of the issue?
Yeah, it's a great question. To be fair to the courts, they are doing their best to provide a really quick turnaround. So the Planning and Environmental Court, I think they aim to have judgment after a case has been heard within 3 months, which is really, really quick. And as I kind of put in writing in the answer there, like our challenge to the Climate Action Plan 2023 was heard in January with judgment delivered in February of last year, which is kind of really, really quick from the court's perspective. It was then heard by the Court of Appeal a few months later, and now with judgment delivered earlier this year, and now it's going to the Supreme Court. So we don't have a hearing date yet, but I expect and hope we'll get one soon. So I think they're very aware of it. Unfortunately, our courts are kind of quite under-resourced, so they don't have kind of the manpower that's needed to get them out as quickly as we would like, but they are really doing their best to get through them as fast as they can.
Another really good kind of, I suppose, legal question that was put there, which I'm sure is on many of our minds. Like, just can government members, like, as individuals, who fail to fulfil their obligation to take climate action, not face criminal prosecution? So, a question coming from Aideen, and looking at is their inaction not going to lead to the breach of peace or undermine public order, and is this inaction not an act of treason as it's threatening the state? What do we think about that?
I think it's a really fascinating question. I'm always blown away by people's creativity whenever we do these types of talks and how people think about legal responsibility and what it should mean. To my knowledge, I don't think that anything like this has been tested to date, but that's not to say that it couldn't be, but I actually just don't know. To be honest, we'd have to do a bit of research into it, but it could be a really interesting research question. And I suspect that as the impacts of the climate crisis become more visible, new tools will be relied on. But I also think that, we do have really strong legal tools at our disposal, like the Climate Act. It's a really good framework. And so we can use what's already maybe been tried and tested as well.
Absolutely. Thanks, Clodagh. we might do try and get through two more before we jump off, if that's okay. But I'm conscious of time because we've kind of gone a little bit over. So if it's okay with folks, I'm actually also simultaneously going to launch a closing poll, if that's all right, just to kind of capture yeah, how you're feeling after the webinars, just seeing as we're going over time. So I'll launch that as we're hearing our kind of final comments on it to answer the questions. I might come to you in terms of this. The two that kind of really stood out there was one about finding it hard to believe that the public support figures that a number of our panelists shared in support of climate action is certainly not their experience. That was coming from John in speaking to people. I mean, I don't know what we think about that. I think that that's a very interesting thing. How do people feel in terms of maybe the breadth of some of where we're getting that, those figures from in terms of the public support, which I know has been quoted again and again as being overwhelmingly in support of climate change, and we acknowledge it, and we believe this is happening. It is due to human activity. But yeah, does anyone want to speak to that? Because I think that that's a very interesting question about what we're hearing, maybe in different parts of the country, where we're living, what circles and spheres we're in. Yeah, this one speaks to me. I'm in a rural village where I live, and I think that this point I think is very interesting. Does anyone want to say anything to that?
I'm sorry, Emma Jane, is the question sort of what are people that
Where
difference between the figures for support for climate action versus what we're sort of hearing ourselves?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's really the point, because I think what John said there is that he's finding it hard to believe that there's this level of public support. It's not really what he's hearing. Deirdre, did you want to speak to that as well?
Yeah, thanks, Emma Jane, and thanks, John, for a great question. And I think it's probably going to the crux of the whole issue, right? So if you were to talk to an ethical politician, they would probably say to you, I'd love to do more, but it never comes up in the door. What comes up in the door is, cost of living, it's places for my kid who needs additional needs, whatever it is, right? So I think you're really spot on. And part of what we're certainly working on is to try and make it into more digestible kind of areas for people. And Claude and everyone on this call has said the same thing. So to make it real to people's lives, I mean, they say that on the doors, climate comes up around 8%. And yet the public polling would have it in the 80s, the level of worry that people have. So there's something there, like let's say for us in the civil society sector and as organizers, where we need to bridge that 50% in some shape or form. Now there'll be there's the national climate conversations, there's loads of research done on why people feel as though they can't interact directly with it. But it's definitely a challenge. And I hear exactly what you're saying. You're going, is that really true? Because then why would people be standing for this? And why wouldn't they vote in politicians who would actually implement the law? But I actually think it is. I think people do really care. I think they're sitting in that kind of difficult position where they do really care. And then when it comes to, the end of the week, for example, that phrase that, it's not about the end of the world for people, it's about getting to the end of the week. And they just can't find a way to square those two things up. But look, that's just an opinion. But I really love the question. Yeah.
Thanks, Deirdre. Yeah, I definitely agree with you in terms of, I think maybe it's a failure of the climate movement, actually. It's not really embedding social justice at the heart, for such a long time, that perhaps we doubt that. I think that that's actually, something for us to really look at. Sarah, did you want to come in on that as well?
And just really briefly, I think that there is a high level of expectation of the policies that should be in place and implemented. So as we've seen and heard today, we've got extremely robust climate law. We've got things that are outlined about how things should be done. And what people might hear in the news isn't necessarily where the gaps are and why those things haven't been, why those gaps haven't been bridged. And putting climate action in opposition to progress, to social justice, things like that. So I think it's really a bit of a communication issue or a narrative issue in the way, and I don't want to reduce it to just being like, oh, if we spoke about it differently. But the energy crisis, the cost of living, That is a climate justice issue. Quality of housing is a climate justice issue. And I think when, like Jerry said, say the word climate, but attach it to all those other issues as well.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I think just given the timing, we're over, but I think that one of the really good questions that came, I think, was one of our first questions, was just a lengthy kind of comment coming from Caroline, talking about like with all these cases and there's a lot happening, various things, trying to get accountability using litigation as a tool, to enforce, authorities and countering that. And she gave like a few different examples and links, which I'll also share with people in follow up. But kind of ended on that question of, well, what is it that still gives us hope, gives most hope? I think that was a really good kind of question, maybe for us to wrap up on. And Sean, I know you had kind of flagged this might be one that you'd like to take as well.
Yeah, just to say thanks for the question, Caroline. I absolutely agree on all the points raised around, at the same time that we're fighting and using the law as a tool to hold governments to account, there's also, like a reactionary type of lawfare that's going on in order to suppress rights. And it's even more important to ramp up the fight against those powers in response. And in response to the question on hope, I guess there's sort of two quotes I often think about in terms of hope when it comes to the climate crisis. There's one from someone called Parker J. Palmer, which is hope is holding a creative tension between what is and what could and should be, and each day doing something to narrow the distance between the two. And I think by just coming to a webinar like this, by just talking to people about climate change, that's taking action to narrow distance between the two. And I think that sort of action is what gives me hope in the day to day. And then in terms of a more, in terms of looking towards the future, there's a Mexican poet, Homero Aradijas, who said there's centuries in which nothing happens, and then years in which centuries pass. And I think, oftentimes we feel like we're banging our heads against the brick wall. On the fight against climate change, but eventually the brick wall will eventually collapse. And I think we will get environmental justice. And there's always something to save at the end of the day, no matter what degree of warming we go to. So I think like that's what gives me hope. The constantly putting the shoulder to the stone and pushing up the hill, and it'll get there eventually. So it's my 2 cents in the matter.
Thank you, Sean. Might just do a quick go around in case anyone wanted to say anything to that, or a final comment from everyone to allow us to close tonight. Would that be okay? And yeah, might start with you, Deirdre.
Well, do you know what? I'm going to leave my comment with Sean's because I thought it was beautiful what he said about the hope. So I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to borrow, and in the spirit of collaboration, I'm going to say what Sean said.
I love that. Thanks, Deirdre. Terry?
You're putting us on the spot, Emma Jane, to say something very intelligent at the end. That's the challenge. I would simply say the more we talk about it, the better. The more we link it to the problems that people are facing in their everyday lives, as Sarah just said, the better. And remember it when there is a next election. That's all I'll say.
Thanks, Jerry. Can I come to you, Clodagh?
Yeah, I fully support Sean's amazingly articulate push piece on hope. And just to say as well, I think that like it's okay to feel it, and it's okay to be at times even overwhelmed by where we are. I think that's a natural response, and it can actually galvanize us if we take action. And I think taking action is what gives us hope. So I would say get involved with Stop Climate Chaos or any other grassroots group. Not Here, Not Anywhere, absolutely amazing. And they're always looking for new members. So check out whoever's in your local area and get involved. And action is what I think gives me hope for sure.
And last but not least, Sarah?
I think the nice thing about this is that in the climate movement, there is space for absolutely everybody. There's so much like, if you care about your community garden, if you care about the bees, if you care about something, there's space for you to come and join in, and you can just share and speak from passion. I think that has been the biggest galvanizer in my smaller circles, is just, you telling your truth honestly and not being shy about it. And I think we can achieve so much when we allow ourselves to be like, if you're a graphic designer, great. If you're really bad at drawing, but you want to put together something to help spread the word about a climate march, that's brilliant. So please do every part of it. Yeah, there's a space for everybody, is what I want to say.
Thanks, Sarah. And I think it's really important. I think I just noticed there in the comments, just to close us on, just not having confidence. Aidan was mentioning there, not having any confidence in the authenticity of our leadership, and the need to really take direct action, looking at Extinction Rebellion and this approach, that the meetings are nice, but maybe we're being too polite. And Aidan, you're not wrong, so but I think there's a place for it too, and I think yeah, I think we do need those of us who can speak out, who can do direct action, those of us who aren't, at that intersection of multiple compounding systems of oppression, have to bear that burden. Those who are most privileged, who can get out, who have the time, who have the resources and the ability to put more pressure, need to do more. We need to take on more than our fair share of the burden. It's an equitable approach, not an equal approach to it. So I'm with you. We need direct action. We need all the action. And I thank you for your comment, because it's really important. And I hope to see you on the streets later this year. I hope to see you meeting with politicians with me and others. And I really do welcome that. We need everybody in the fight, and everybody has to do something. So yeah, I think what gives me hope is the diversity of people that we have coming and joining our events regularly, and people who follow up with us, and people who do watch back and get back in touch, and who are organising at a local level. And we are seeing more groups setting up, wanting to take action, people wanting to draw those connections, make identifying the patterns, and connecting the dots. And I think it's becoming clearer and clearer. And I think that is a result, a direct result, from people having those conversations that are difficult, that are awkward, that start with politeness. And sometimes that's an entry point. It's an opportunity. It's a way for us to, get people on board, and bring them on that journey. And I believe we can do that when we do it together. So we need lots of it, lots more of it. And hopefully we'll see again. We'll follow up with the link to this recording, so you can share it with anybody who hasn't been able to make it tonight, or use it as a tool for discussion with the groups that you're involved in. And yeah, we'll be having some more upcoming sessions like this coming up over the coming weeks. So yeah, share with a friend, bring somebody with you to join the next one, have a conversation while you're watching. I know that there was a couple of people who got in touch with me from the last session that we had in LNG, who said that they were a group of 9 women sitting together having the chats while watching Jerry talking about his myths and Aideen, and it was great to hear that feedback. So there's lots of ways that we can do it. But thank you everybody for joining and taking time out of your evening, and we will catch you next time. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, bye.